When an Irish Republican Catholic actor was cast as England's most hated Puritan leader, it sparked one of cinema's most ironic casting decisions. Behind the epic battles and Oscar-winning costumes lay bizarre production secrets, from massive Spanish army extras to a two-acre fake Parliament Square that fooled audiences worldwide. Here are the 15 weird facts you didn't know about Cromwell. Fact 1. Irish Republican plays Irish enemy. When Richard Harris accepted the lead role in Cromwell, it created one of cinema's most jaw-dropping casting ironies. Harris wasn't just any Irish actor. He was a fierce Irish nationalist who openly supported the Provisional Irish Republican Army from 1973 until 1984. He was also a proud Catholic from Limerick who frequently spoke about his deep love for Ireland and his hatred of English oppression. Yet here he was, playing Oliver Cromwell, the man widely considered the most hated Englishman in all of Irish history. Oliver Cromwell's brutal campaign in Ireland between 1649 and 1653 left deep scars that still haunted Irish memory 3 centuries later. Cromwell himself had described the massacre at Drogheda as the righteous judgment of God on these barbarous wretches, referring to the Irish people. For most Irish families, Cromwell represented everything evil about English rule, a man who had allowed countless massacres and left Ireland devastated. When writer and director Ken Hughes first approached Harris about the role, he actually warned the actor against it, telling him that no self-respecting Irishman should ever play Oliver Cromwell. Harris's response was simply to laugh and take the job anyway. His reasoning was surprisingly pragmatic. The salary was simply too good to pass up, and Harris believed an actor didn't need to personally agree with his character's beliefs or actions. Even more bizarre, Harris wasn't the only Catholic playing a Protestant hero in this film. Alec Guinness, Frank Finlay, and Patrick Magee were all Catholics as well, with Magee also being an Irish Republican. The film about the famously anti-Catholic Cromwell had become a production dominated by the very people Cromwell would have despised. Harris later said he drew inspiration from Cromwell's idealistic nature and his goal to reform society, choosing to focus on those aspects rather than the historical persecution of his own people. Fact 2. Director warned against casting choice. Ken Hughes knew exactly what he was doing when he approached Richard Harris about playing Oliver Cromwell, but he also knew how controversial the casting would be. During their initial meeting, Hughes looked directly at the Irish actor and delivered what might be the most honest warning any director has ever given to a potential star. No self-respecting Irishman should ever play Oliver Cromwell, Hughes told Harris bluntly, essentially giving him permission to walk away from what would become one of the biggest British films of 1970. Hughes understood the historical weight of what he was asking. Oliver Cromwell wasn't just any English historical figure, he was the man who had devastated Ireland in the 1600s, leading campaigns that resulted in massive civilian casualties and left scars that still ran deep in Irish culture 3 centuries later. For an Irish actor to portray Cromwell would be like asking someone to play their own family's oppressor, and Hughes was fully aware of this uncomfortable reality. But Richard Harris's reaction caught everyone off guard. Instead of being offended or declining the role, Harris simply laughed at Hughes's warning. The actor's casual response to such a serious concern revealed something important about Harris's approach to his craft. He was willing to separate his personal beliefs from his professional opportunities. Harris had already established himself as someone who didn't shy away from controversial roles, and the substantial paycheck certainly helped make the decision easier. This exchange became legendary among the cast and crew, representing the unusual nature of the entire production. Hughes had essentially acknowledged that his casting choice was historically and culturally problematic, yet both men proceeded anyway. The director's warning served as an early indication that this film would be filled with the kind of contradictions and ironies that would define its entire production process, from casting to the final cut. Fact 3. Largest English movie set ever built. The production team at Shepperton Studios embarked on what became the most ambitious set construction project in English film history when they decided to recreate 17th-century London from scratch. More than 200 skilled workers spent months building a massive 2-acre outdoor set that meticulously recreated Parliament Square exactly as it appeared in 1642, complete with every architectural detail that audiences would expect from the heart of English government during the Civil War period. This wasn't just a simple backdrop or a few building facades. The construction crew built an entire functioning cityscape that included the House of Commons, Westminster Palace, Westminster Abbey, and roughly 50 other period-accurate buildings that surrounded the famous square. The attention to detail was extraordinary, with workers researching historical records and architectural plans to ensure that every doorway, window, and roofline matched what actually existed 3 centuries earlier. The set was so convincing that many viewers assumed the filmmakers had simply used the real Parliament Square with some digital touch-ups, not realizing they were looking at a completely artificial recreation. The scale of this construction project broke all previous records for English-made films and required an enormous portion of the movie's budget. Workers had to construct not only the visible buildings but also create realistic interiors for scenes that would take place inside Parliament, along with historically accurate cobblestone streets, period-appropriate signage, and even working fireplaces and chimneys that would look authentic in wide shots. The set became so large and detailed that it essentially functioned as a small town, with cast and crew often getting lost among the maze of streets and buildings. This massive construction achievement allowed director Ken Hughes to film sweeping panoramic shots that captured the grandeur and political importance of Parliament Square during one of the most turbulent periods in English history, giving the film a sense of authenticity and scale that would have been impossible with smaller, more traditional movie sets. Fact 4. Spanish Army as English Civil War extras. When Ken Hughes needed massive armies for the film's epic battle sequences, he made the unusual decision to film entirely in Spain and recruit the actual Spanish military to portray both sides of the English Civil War. The production team chose the Sierra de Urbasa region in northern Navarre, a mountainous plateau filled with English-looking meadows and beech woods that could convincingly double for the English countryside, where the real battles of Edge Hill and Naseby had taken place 3 centuries earlier. The Spanish location offered several practical advantages that made it irresistible to the filmmakers. Most importantly, the landscapes were completely free from modern buildings, telephone poles, and electrical pylons that would have ruined the historical authenticity of wide battle shots. The rolling hills and open fields of the Urbasa y Andia Natural Park provided the perfect backdrop for massive cavalry charges and infantry formations without any visible signs of the 20th century creeping into the frame. But the real genius of filming in Spain was gaining access to hundreds of Spanish soldiers who could serve as extras in the battle scenes. These weren't amateur actors or local volunteers, they were trained military personnel who already knew how to march in formation, handle weapons properly, and follow complex battlefield commands. The Spanish army provided soldiers who would portray both Oliver Cromwell's disciplined Roundhead forces and King Charles's flamboyant Cavalier troops, essentially fighting against themselves in different costumes depending on which side the scene required. The irony was remarkable when you considered the historical context. Spanish soldiers, representing a Catholic nation that had once been England's enemy, were now recreating the English Civil War where Protestant and Catholic sympathies had played such a crucial role. The same men would put on Puritan armor in the morning to fight for Parliament, then change into Royalist uniforms in the afternoon to defend the king, creating one of the most unusual military reenactments ever captured on film. Fact 5. Massive costume and prop operation. The costume and prop departments for Cromwell undertook what became one of the most ambitious period recreation projects in film history, creating an entire 17th-century world from scratch. The production team manufactured close to 4,000 individual costumes, ranging from elaborate royal court dress to simple peasant clothing, ensuring that every single person who appeared on screen would look authentically period-appropriate. This massive undertaking required months of research into historical fashion, fabric techniques, and social class distinctions to make sure that a nobleman's outfit would never be confused with a merchant's clothing. Beyond the costumes, the prop department sourced or created 16,000 separate items that would fill the sets and give actors realistic objects to handle during their performances. This staggering number included everything from period-accurate weapons and armor to household items like candlesticks, plates, books, and furniture that would appear in background shots. Many of these props had to be specially crafted using traditional techniques because modern manufacturing methods would have created items that looked wrong under the careful scrutiny of film cameras. Perhaps the most unusual aspect of this massive operation was the wig procurement project that stretched across multiple European countries. The costume designers ordered thousands of wigs from suppliers throughout Europe because they needed historically accurate hairstyles for hundreds of cast members and extras. 17th-century hair fashion was quite specific, with different styles indicating social class, profession, and political allegiance, so the wig department had to ensure that Puritan characters wore appropriately simple styles while Cavalier supporters displayed the elaborate curls and ornate styling that marked their loyalty to the king. This incredible attention to detail in costumes, props, and hair ultimately earned the film its only Academy Award win when Vittorio Nino Novarese took home the Oscar for Best Costume Design. The massive scale of the costume operation demonstrated the production's commitment to historical authenticity, even when other aspects of the film took significant liberties with actual historical events. Fact 6. Visible safety wire in hanging scene. One of the most embarrassing technical mistakes in Cromwell occurs during a dramatic execution scene where Oliver Cromwell orders an officer hanged for treason in the military camp. At exactly 1 hour, 38 minutes, and 48 seconds into the film, viewers with sharp eyes can spot a glaring safety error that completely breaks the illusion of the supposedly deadly punishment being carried out on screen. The scene shows the executed officer's body hanging from the rope, slowly turning toward the camera in what should be a somber moment demonstrating Cromwell's harsh military discipline. However, as the body rotates, a thin metal safety wire becomes clearly visible, running directly from the hangman's knot down to the actor's jacket collar. This wire was actually connected to a hidden chest harness that the actor wore underneath his costume, designed to support his full body weight and prevent any chance of actual strangulation during filming. This type of safety equipment was absolutely necessary for the actor's protection, but the wire should have been painted to match the background or digitally removed in post-production to maintain the scene's dramatic impact. Instead, the shiny metal wire stands out against the darker background, creating an obvious reminder that audiences are watching a movie rather than witnessing a real execution. The mistake becomes even more noticeable because the camera holds on the shot long enough for viewers to clearly see the safety apparatus. This visible safety wire represents the kind of technical oversight that was more common in 1970, when film budgets for special effects and post-production were much smaller than they would become in later decades. The crew likely hoped that audiences wouldn't notice such a small detail, but the wire became one of those movie mistakes that sharp-eyed viewers love to point out. Modern filmmakers would almost certainly catch and fix this type of error before the film reached theaters, making it a charming reminder of how different movie-making was 50 years ago. Fact 7. Catholic actors playing anti-Catholic heroes. The religious irony of Cromwell's casting went far beyond just Richard Harris playing the title role, creating what might be the most religiously contradictory cast in film history. Oliver Cromwell was famously one of the most anti-Catholic leaders in English history, a hardcore Puritan who viewed Catholicism as a dangerous foreign influence that needed to be stamped out of England completely. Yet the filmmakers ended up casting multiple Catholic actors in key roles throughout the production, turning the movie into an unintentional showcase of the very people Cromwell would have considered his enemies. Alec Guinness, who delivered a brilliant performance as King Charles I, was a devout Catholic who had converted to the faith in 1956 and remained deeply religious throughout his life. Frank Finlay, who played the important supporting role of John Carter, was also Catholic, as was Patrick Magee, who portrayed the Puritan preacher Hugh Peters. The casting became even more ironic when you consider that Magee was not only Catholic but also an Irish Republican, meaning he shared both the religious and political backgrounds that Cromwell had specifically targeted during his brutal Irish campaigns. This religious contradiction extended beyond individual performances to affect the entire tone of the production. These Catholic actors were essentially portraying the men who had historically persecuted their own faith, delivering passionate speeches about Protestant purity and the dangers of Catholic influence on English society. The situation became so notable that crew members joked about the irony during filming, particularly when Catholic actors had to deliver Cromwell's most anti-Catholic dialogue with convincing fervor. For Patrick Magee in particular, the role represented a double contradiction since he was playing a Puritan preacher while being both Catholic and Irish Republican. The casting choices were driven primarily by talent and availability, rather than religious considerations, but they created a fascinating behind-the-scenes dynamic where actors had to completely separate their personal beliefs from their professional performances in ways that went far beyond typical character preparation. Fact 8. Early Timothy Dalton, future Bond role. Long before Timothy Dalton became famous as the fourth actor to portray James Bond, he appeared in Cromwell as Prince Rupert of the Rhine, one of his earliest significant film roles that helped establish his career in period dramas. At just 24 years old, Dalton brought a youthful energy and theatrical intensity to the role of King Charles's nephew, the flamboyant Cavalier commander who led the Royalist cavalry with reckless courage and unwavering loyalty to his uncle's cause. Dalton's portrayal of Prince Rupert showcased many of the qualities that would later make him an ideal choice for James Bond 17 years later. His natural charisma, physical presence, and ability to convey both aristocratic elegance and deadly competence in battle scenes gave audiences an early glimpse of the commanding screen presence that would eventually land him the role of the world's most famous secret agent. The role also demonstrated his skill with period dialogue and costume drama, genres that would become a significant part of his career throughout the 1970s. What makes this casting particularly interesting is that Cromwell featured several other actors who would later appear in James Bond films, creating an unexpected connection between this historical epic and the spy franchise. Charles Grey, who played the Earl of Essex, would later become the villain Ernst Stavro Blofeld in Diamonds Are Forever. Geoffrey Keane, who had a supporting role as a parliamentary member, would go on to play Minister of Defense Frederick Grey in multiple Bond films throughout the 1970s and 80s. During the filming of Cromwell, Richard Harris and Timothy Dalton developed a genuine friendship that lasted for years, with Harris serving as something of a mentor to the younger actor. This relationship helped Dalton navigate the challenges of working on such a large-scale production and gave him valuable experience in handling the pressures of major film roles that would serve him well when he eventually stepped into the demanding world of international espionage cinema as James Bond. Fact 9. Cut Ireland scenes due to troubles. The filmmakers originally planned to include extensive scenes depicting Oliver Cromwell's controversial military campaign in Ireland, but these sequences were completely removed from the final cut due to the violent political situation unfolding in Northern Ireland during the film's production in 1969 and 1970. The decision to eliminate this entire storyline represented one of the most significant editorial choices in the movie's development, essentially erasing a major chapter of Cromwell's historical legacy that many consider his most brutal and defining period. Cromwell's Irish campaign from 1649 to 1653 was historically one of his most controversial actions, involving sieges and battles that resulted in massive civilian casualties and left deep scars in Irish collective memory. The filmmakers had initially planned to show these events as part of Cromwell's complete story, but the escalating violence of the Troubles in Northern Ireland made any depiction of English military action against Irish populations extremely sensitive and potentially inflammatory. The timing couldn't have been worse for including such material. The late 1960s and early 1970s marked some of the most intense periods of conflict in Northern Ireland, with bombings, riots, and military interventions becoming regular news headlines. Studio executives and the filmmakers themselves realized that showing Cromwell's forces attacking Irish towns and civilians would be seen as either endorsing historical English brutality or potentially inflaming current tensions between Irish Republicans and British authorities. This editorial decision fundamentally changed the character arc that audiences would see on screen. Without the Irish campaign, Cromwell appears more as a reluctant leader focused on domestic English politics, rather than the ambitious military commander who extended his reach across the British Isles. The missing scenes would have shown a darker, more complex side of Cromwell's character, but their removal allowed the film to present him in a more sympathetic light, while avoiding any connection to the contemporary violence that was devastating communities across Ireland. Fact 10. Wrong army uniform colors. One of the most glaring historical mistakes in Cromwell involves the complete reversal of which armies wore which colored uniforms during the English Civil War. The film shows Oliver Cromwell's disciplined new model army wearing dark brown uniforms throughout the battle scenes, while King Charles's royalist forces are dressed in bright red coats that make them stand out dramatically against the landscape. This visual choice was probably made for dramatic effect, but it represents the exact opposite of what actually happened during the real conflict in the 1640s. In historical reality, Cromwell's parliamentary forces wore red coats because red dye was the cheapest and most readily available color for mass-producing military uniforms. The parliamentary army needed to outfit thousands of soldiers quickly and economically, so they chose the most practical option that would allow them to create a standardized appearance for their troops. This decision was so successful that red became the traditional color for British military uniforms for centuries afterward, leading to the famous nickname Redcoats that would later be applied to British soldiers during the American Revolutionary War. The Royalist forces, on the other hand, wore a much wider variety of colors depending on which regiment they belonged to, and who was funding their equipment. Different Cavalier units might wear blue, green, yellow, or other colors based on their commander's preferences and financial resources, but red was definitely not their standard choice. Blue was actually a popular color among many royalist regiments, creating a visual contrast with the parliamentary red that the filmmakers completely ignored. This uniform mix-up demonstrates how the movie prioritized visual storytelling over historical accuracy. The filmmakers probably felt that showing the disciplined Puritans in somber brown would better represent their serious religious character, while dressing the flamboyant Cavaliers in bright red would emphasize their flashy and aristocratic nature. However, this artistic choice inadvertently taught audiences the wrong lesson about one of the most basic facts of English Civil War military history, creating confusion that has persisted among casual history fans for decades. Fact 11. Battle wound continuity error. Sharp-eyed viewers can spot one of the most obvious continuity mistakes in Cromwell by watching Richard Harris's left arm during the two major battle sequences that bookend the film's military action. During the chaotic cavalry charge at the Battle of Edgehill, which is supposed to be Cromwell's first major military engagement, Harris clearly has a visible wound on his left arm that appears to be bleeding through his uniform. However, this same wound doesn't officially happen until much later in the story during the climactic Battle of Naseby, where audiences actually see Cromwell receive the injury during combat. This glaring error reveals the behind-the-scenes reality of how movies are made, showing that the battle scenes were filmed completely out of sequence from how they appear in the final story. The filmmakers shot the Naseby battle first, during which Harris received his makeup wound as part of that scene's action, and then later filmed the Edgehill sequence while still wearing the same injury makeup. When the film was edited together in chronological order, no one caught the fact that Cromwell was sporting a battle wound he wasn't supposed to receive until several scenes later. The mistake becomes even more obvious when you consider that the Battle of Edgehill was supposed to be a devastating defeat for Parliament's forces, with Cromwell barely escaping the field alive and vowing to create a better-trained army. Having him appear already wounded suggests he's a battle-hardened veteran rather than the relatively inexperienced cavalry officer that the script describes. The wound also implies that he's already been through significant combat, which contradicts the narrative setup that positions Edgehill as his first real taste of serious warfare. This type of continuity error was much more common in 1970 than it would be today, when digital editing tools make it easier to spot and fix such mistakes. The wound error likely went unnoticed during the editing process because the team was focused on larger storytelling concerns and didn't have the luxury of frame-by-frame digital review that modern filmmakers take for granted. Fact 12. 3-hour cut slashed by 51 minutes. Ken Hughes originally assembled a massive 3-hour and 15-minute version of Cromwell that told the complete story of the English Civil War in epic detail. But studio pressure and commercial concerns forced him to cut 51 minutes from his preferred version, fundamentally changing the pacing and depth of the final film. Hughes had envisioned Cromwell as a sweeping historical epic that would rival the great Hollywood spectacles of the 1960s, giving audiences a comprehensive look at one of the most turbulent periods in British history through an intimate character study of its most controversial figure. The original cut included extensive character development scenes, additional battle sequences, more detailed political negotiations, and deeper exploration of the religious conflicts that drove the Civil War. Hughes had filmed far more material than what eventually reached theaters, including subplot involving secondary characters and longer scenes that showed the gradual transformation of Cromwell from reluctant politician to military dictator. The 3-hour version also contained more nuanced portrayals of both sides of the conflict, avoiding some of the simplified good versus evil dynamics that critics later complained about in the theatrical release. Studio executives demanded the cuts primarily for practical reasons related to theater scheduling and audience attention spans. A 3-hour and 15-minute film could only be shown twice per day in most theaters, limiting box office potential, while the shorter 2-hour and 24-minute version allowed for 3 daily screenings and better commercial prospects. The decision reflected the ongoing tension between artistic vision and commercial reality that affected many ambitious films of the era. Hughes himself remained proud of his work despite the forced cuts, famously declaring in 1970 that, "I think it's the best thing I've ever done," referring to his original longer vision rather than the truncated theatrical release. The lost footage has never been recovered or released, meaning that audiences have never seen Hughes's complete intended version of this ambitious historical epic, leaving one of cinema's great what-if scenarios forever unanswered. Fact 13. Studios wanted Charlton Heston instead. The casting of Richard Harris as Oliver Cromwell wasn't the studio's first choice, as executives originally wanted Charlton Heston to play the Puritan leader in what they hoped would become another epic historical blockbuster, similar to Ben-Hur or El Cid. Heston was at the height of his fame in the late 1960s, having established himself as Hollywood's go-to actor for larger-than-life historical figures who combined physical presence with moral authority. Studio executives believed that Heston's commanding screen presence and proven box office appeal would make him the perfect choice to portray England's most controversial military and political leader. However, director Ken Hughes disagreed with the studio's preference for Heston, feeling that the American actor wasn't appropriate for this particular role despite his impressive track record in historical epics. Hughes had a specific vision for how Cromwell should be portrayed, and he didn't think Heston's heroic, almost mythical screen persona would work for the complex, morally ambiguous character he wanted to create. Heston himself wasn't particularly interested in the project either, noting in his diary on November 2, 1961, that he had turned down Warwick's Cromwell script. When the Heston option fell through, Hughes made efforts to interest Richard Burton in reading the script, hoping that Burton's Welsh background and reputation for playing tortured, introspective characters would bring the right kind of intensity to Cromwell's internal struggles. Burton was one of the most respected dramatic actors of his generation, known for his ability to portray characters wrestling with moral and political dilemmas, which seemed perfect for a story about a man torn between his religious convictions and his growing political power. Unfortunately, Burton showed no interest in the project and refused even to read Hughes's script, leaving the director to continue his search for the right actor. This rejection eventually led Hughes back to Richard Harris, who had actually expressed interest in the role years earlier when financiers didn't consider him a big enough star to carry such an expensive production. Fact 14. Multiple prominent actors cut entirely. When Ken Hughes was forced to trim 51 minutes from his original 3-hour and 15-minute cut of Cromwell, several well-known British actors saw their performances completely disappear from the final film, including some who had invested significant time and effort into what they thought would be important supporting roles. The most tragic casualty of these cuts was Felix Aylmer, a distinguished veteran actor who had appeared in dozens of British films throughout his long career, including roles in classics like Hamlet and The Angel with the Trumpet. His portrayal of an archbishop in Cromwell turned out to be his final film performance before retirement, but audiences never got to see this farewell appearance because his entire role was eliminated during the editing process. The cutting process also removed the work of several other prominent English character actors who were well known to British audiences of the time. Tony Caunter, George A. Cooper, and Peter Bennett, three actors who had built solid reputations through their appearances in numerous British films and television productions, found themselves completely edited out of the final version, despite having filmed substantial scenes. Brian Pringle, another respected character actor known for his work in both comedy and drama, also saw his role disappear entirely when the studio demanded a shorter running time. These deletions represented more than just lost screen time. They eliminated entire subplot and character relationships that Hughes had carefully crafted to show the broader social and political impact of the English Civil War beyond just the main characters. The removed scenes likely included interactions between religious leaders, parliamentary debates involving secondary politicians, and character moments that would have provided greater depth to the historical context surrounding Cromwell's rise to power. For the actors involved, having their work completely removed from such a high-profile production was particularly disappointing, since Cromwell became one of the biggest British box office hits of 1970. These experienced performers had expected their roles to be seen by large audiences and contribute to their ongoing careers, only to discover that their contributions had vanished entirely from the final cut. Fact 15. 10 years of research. Marketing lie. The marketing campaign for Cromwell boldly proclaimed that the film was made after 10 years of research, suggesting that audiences could expect an exceptionally accurate and well-researched historical drama that would educate as well as entertain. This impressive claim appeared in promotional materials, press releases, and movie posters designed to give the film credibility with history buffs and educators who might recommend it as a learning tool about the English Civil War period. The studio clearly wanted viewers to believe they were watching a meticulously researched historical recreation rather than just another Hollywood costume drama. However, the reality was quite different, as the finished film contained such an enormous number of historical errors that movie mistake websites and history enthusiasts have compiled lengthy lists dedicated entirely to cataloging Cromwell's factual problems. These errors range from minor timeline issues to major misrepresentations of key historical events, including showing Cromwell present at battles he never attended, depicting conversations between people who never met, and completely reversing important political relationships that actually existed during the 1640s. Some of the most glaring mistakes include placing Cromwell at the Battle of Edgehill, when he actually arrived days after the fighting ended, showing him as one of the 5 members of Parliament that King Charles tried to arrest when his name wasn't on the actual warrant, and depicting Henry Ireton offering Cromwell the crown when Ireton had been dead for 6 years, when that offer was historically made. The film also shows peers and commoners sitting together in the same parliamentary chamber when they actually met in completely separate houses throughout this period. The contrast between the 10 years of research claim and the actual historical accuracy became so notorious that film critics and historians frequently pointed to Cromwell as an example of how marketing promises don't always match the final product. The extensive research may have been conducted, but it apparently didn't prevent the filmmakers from prioritizing dramatic storytelling over historical truth when the two came into conflict during the scriptwriting and filming process.